The priest who committed the perfect crime at 84 years old. At 84 years old, most people are remembered for what they built, for the families they raised, for the lives they touched. This man was remembered for what he got away with. For decades, he stood at the front of a church. He delivered sermons about forgiveness. He listened to confessions whispered behind closed doors. He spoke calmly about sin, repentance, and redemption. And all the while, law enforcement never suspected him. No criminal record, no violent history, no obvious motive. Just a priest, old, soft-spoken, and trusted by everyone around him. The crime itself left almost nothing behind. No clear witnesses, no immediate suspects, no evidence that pointed in the right direction. Investigators searched outward, friends, family, strangers, never considering the man who had been closest the entire time. Years passed, memories faded, paper trails went cold, and the case quietly slipped into the category most crimes eventually reach, unsolved. Until something changed. Not a confession, not a sudden arrest, not even new forensic technology. What reopened the case was something far more unsettling. A pattern, a series of overlooked details that, when placed together, didn't suggest rage or impulse or desperation. They suggested patience, the kind of patience only someone deeply familiar with human behavior could possess. Someone who understood guilt and how to hide it. Someone who knew how investigations worked, because people trusted him to tell the truth. By the time authorities finally understood what they were looking at, the man responsible was no longer running. He wasn't hiding. He was aging. And with each passing year, the question became more uncomfortable. Was this a crime that could still be punished? Or one that had been perfected too well to ever fully answer for? Because if this man was guilty, it meant something far worse than a single crime. It meant the perfect crime had been hiding in plain sight. Behind a collar no one ever thought to question. This channel exposes the realities behind crimes most people never fully understand. If you want the full story, and how cases like this stay hidden for decades, subscribe now. Before we begin, tap like, leave a comment, and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us uncover the darkest corners of the prison system. Now let's step inside. At 6:12 a.m., the cell door opened the same way it always did. Metal on metal. A sharp, mechanical sound that echoed briefly down the corridor before dissolving into routine. The man inside the cell did not flinch. He was already awake. At 84 years old, sleep no longer came easily. His body woke before his mind wanted to, conditioned by decades of early mornings that had nothing to do with prison. Long before uniforms and head counts, his life had revolved around schedules, fixed hours, predictable rituals, repetition. Prison had not disrupted that. It had only replaced one system with another. He sat upright on the narrow bunk, hands folded neatly in his lap, eyes forward. His posture was deliberate, almost formal, as though he were waiting to be addressed rather than counted. The correctional officer paused for half a second longer than usual. Not because the inmate was threatening, because he wasn't. Old inmates were common. Quiet inmates were common. But this man carried himself differently. He looked like someone who had spent his entire life being listened to. 6:14 a.m. Counts good, the officer muttered, marking the clipboard before moving on. The door slid shut again. The man exhaled slowly through his nose. Another day accounted for. 6:30 a.m. He rose carefully from the bunk, moving with practiced caution. His joints ached, but not enough to complain. He had learned long ago that pain was more manageable when acknowledged privately. At the stainless steel sink, he splashed water on his face and studied his reflection. The mirror was scratched and dull, distorting his features just enough to blur the details. Still, he recognized himself. The thin face, the pale eyes, the faint tremor in his hands. What he did not see, what no mirror could show, was how thoroughly he had prepared for this moment long before it ever arrived. He dried his face slowly, folded the towel, and placed it exactly where it belonged. Order mattered, especially now. 7:05 a.m. Breakfast was served in silence. He sat alone at a small metal table, tray positioned squarely in front of him. The food was untouched for several minutes as he watched the other inmates shuffle past. Younger men moved loudly, shoulders tense, eyes scanning. They were alert in the way people are when they believe danger might arrive suddenly. He did not share that belief. He understood something they didn't. Most danger doesn't arrive suddenly. It arrives gradually, disguised as familiarity. He lifted his spoon and began to eat. 7:42 a.m. Across the room, an inmate laughed too loudly. A correctional officer barked a warning. Chairs scraped against the floor. The old man never looked up. His focus remained inward, where memory had begun its slow, unavoidable drift backward. 35 years earlier. 4:55 a.m. The day had begun much the same way. Early, quiet, predictable. He stood alone in a small kitchen, pouring hot water over coffee grounds. The light above the sink flickered briefly before stabilizing. He preferred mornings like this, before others arrived, before expectations began pulling at him from all directions. Solitude sharpened his thoughts, and he needed clarity, because by the end of the day, something irreversible would occur. Not suddenly, not violently, but precisely. 6:10 a.m. He arrived at the church before anyone else. The building was empty, cool, and still. Sunlight filtered weakly through stained glass, casting muted colors across the floor. He paused near the entrance, listening. Nothing. No footsteps. No voices. No movement. Exactly as planned. He unlocked his office and placed his belongings inside. Keys, notebook, a folded piece of paper he had read so many times he no longer needed to unfold it. He closed the door gently. He had always been careful with doors. 7:30 a.m. The first parishioners arrived. They greeted him warmly, as they always did. Smiles. Familiar nods. Quiet gratitude. To them, he was not just a priest. He was a constant. Someone who had been there through births, deaths, divorces, reconciliations. Someone whose presence suggested stability in a world that rarely offered it. He returned their greetings with practiced ease. Nothing in his demeanor suggested tension. Nothing betrayed intent. 9:15 a.m. The main character entered the building. At the time, no one would have described him as such. He was simply another person passing through the orbit of a trusted figure. He arrived alone, moving cautiously, as though unsure whether he was welcome. His shoulders were slightly hunched. His eyes lingered on exits. People like him often drew sympathy rather than suspicion, and sympathy lowered defenses. The priest noticed him immediately, not because he stood out, because he didn't. 9:27 a.m. They spoke briefly. Nothing memorable. Nothing that would later stand out in reports or recollections. A few exchanged words. A nod. An understanding glance. To anyone observing, it looked ordinary. That was the point. 11:48 a.m. The building emptied gradually. Lunch hour approached. People drifted away. By noon, only 2 people remained inside, and no one thought that was strange. 12:03 p.m. They were alone. Not isolated. Not hidden. Just unobserved. The priest closed one door and left another open. He positioned himself closer to the exit than the other man. Control without force. That had always been his method. 12:17 p.m. There was no struggle. No raised voices. No sudden movement that might have alerted anyone outside. What happened unfolded quietly, efficiently, guided by a mind that had rehearsed every step. Later, investigators would search desperately for signs of violence. They would find none, because violence was never the plan. Back to the present. 8:21 a.m. The old man finished breakfast and returned his tray. His steps were slow but steady as he made his way back down the corridor. Other inmates brushed past him. None spoke. None challenged him. He was invisible now, just another aging body moving through the system. And invisibility had always been his greatest asset. 9 a.m. Inside his cell again, he sat on the bunk and closed his eyes. Not to rest, to remember. Memory had become unavoidable since his incarceration. There was nothing left to distract him from it. And so, details surfaced. The precision of it all still impressed him. 10:34 a.m. When investigators finally reopened the case decades later, it was not because of a confession. It was because someone noticed a discrepancy. A small one. The kind of detail that means nothing until it means everything. A time that didn't align. A statement repeated too perfectly. A presence that had never been questioned. And once that presence was questioned, everything else began to unravel. 11:02 a.m. The priest, now an inmate, had answered every question calmly. He always had. Age did not change that. What age did change was perception. Because an 84-year-old man could no longer be imagined as capable of calculated harm. That assumption protected him longer than anything else ever had. 12:40 p.m. Lunch count. Another mark on another clipboard. Another day progressing exactly as expected. He ate slowly, methodically. Time moved differently now. Each hour was identical. Each moment an echo. 2:15 p.m. In the afternoon light, he sat on his bunk and looked at his hands. Hands that had baptized children. Hands that had held the dying. Hands that had signed documents, unlocked doors, guided people into trust. Hands that had never been suspected, until they were. 4:58 p.m. As evening approached, the weight of what he had done pressed in, not with guilt, but with inevitability. When routine became control at 12:07 a.m., sleep did not come easily. It rarely did anymore. The inmate lay flat on his back, hands folded across his chest, staring into the darkness above him. The ceiling was invisible, but he knew every inch of it. The faint cracks, the uneven paint, the place where moisture once gathered before maintenance sealed it over. His breathing was slow, measured, not the breathing of fear, the breathing of someone who had learned long ago that control begins internally. Prison stripped men of many things, privacy, freedom, dignity, but it could not strip them of discipline unless they surrendered it willingly. He never had. 12:41 a.m. A distant shout echoed down the unit. Someone arguing with someone else. A disagreement over space, over words, over nothing that mattered by morning. The old man did not react. Conflict had always been loud. Control had always been quiet. 1:26 a.m. Memory intruded again, not as images, as sequences, as timing. He remembered how often people misunderstood planning. They believed it required obsession, fixation, constant rehearsal. In reality, planning was about alignment. You didn't force events. You waited for them to line up. And when they did, you stepped aside just enough for them to unfold naturally. That was what he had done. That was why no one noticed. 35 years earlier. 5:32 a.m. He woke before the alarm. He always did on important days. The house was silent. Outside, the street was empty. No cars passed. No footsteps echoed. He sat on the edge of the bed for a moment, grounding himself. Emotion was not useful today. Emotion created errors. Today required clarity. 6:18 a.m. He dressed slowly, deliberately. Every movement was familiar. Every choice already made weeks earlier. There was no improvisation left, only execution. He checked his watch. Right on schedule. 7:02 a.m. The walk to the church took him past houses where curtains remained drawn. People slept, unaware that they were about to become bystanders to something they would never fully understand. He greeted a passing jogger with a nod. The jogger nodded back. Trust, exchanged effortlessly. 8:10 a.m. Inside the building, the day unfolded exactly as predicted. The same faces, the same greetings, the same casual assumptions. He paid attention to details others ignored. Who lingered? Who left early? Who avoided eye contact? People thought he listened for sins. In truth, he listened for patterns. 9:14 a.m. The inmate, though he would not be called that for decades, entered the building again. He was tense, not frightened, just uncertain. Uncertainty made people malleable. The priest noticed the slight hesitation in his step, the way his gaze searched for direction. Direction could be offered, and once accepted, rarely questioned. 9:29 a.m. They spoke again, this time longer. Still nothing incriminating. Still nothing memorable. The conversation blended seamlessly into the background noise of ordinary life. That was the brilliance of it. Nothing stood out. 10:46 a.m. The inmate sat alone on a bench, hands clasped, eyes lowered. He was waiting, waiting without knowing for what. That was how dependency formed. 11:12 a.m. The priest approached calmly. Not urgently. Urgency created suspicion. He suggested moving to a quieter space. The suggestion sounded reasonable. Necessary, even. No one objected. Why would they? 11:24 a.m. The door closed softly. Not locked. Just closed. The priest positioned himself near the light switch, the inmate nearer the chair. Subtle. Intentional. He spoke first. Gently. Authority masked as concern. 11:41 a.m. Time slowed. Words were exchanged. Some meaningful. Some irrelevant. The priest steered the conversation without force, redirecting it whenever it strayed too close to danger. He had done this thousands of times. This was no different. 12:02 p.m. What happened next would later be described as unremarkable. No noise. No witnesses. No interruption. Only absence. Back to the present. 2:58 a.m. The inmate opened his eyes. The memory had ended where it always did. At the moment, control transferred completely. He exhaled slowly. 3:37 a.m. Footsteps passed his cell. A flashlight beam swept briefly across his face, then moved on. He did not pretend to sleep. There was no need. 5:01 a.m. Morning arrived without announcement. The unit stirred. Metal doors clicked. Radios crackled. Orders were exchanged in low voices. Routine resumed. 5:44 a.m. The inmate sat up as the lights brightened. Another day beginning. Another reminder that time here moved differently. Out there, years had passed unnoticed. In here, minutes dragged. 6:20 a.m. Breakfast again. The same tray. The same seat. The same silence. Across from him, a younger inmate stared openly. Curiosity. Fear. Disbelief. The old man met his gaze briefly, then looked away. People often searched his face for signs of regret. They never found them. 7:11 a.m. After breakfast, he returned to his cell and sat. Waiting. Waiting had become his specialty. 8:03 a.m. When investigators reopened the case decades later, they did so quietly. No announcements. No press conferences. Just a review. A second look at old files. Fresh eyes on familiar names. 8:47 a.m. One investigator noticed something small. A statement given years earlier. It wasn't wrong. It was too right. The times aligned too perfectly. The phrasing repeated too consistently. Memory does not work like that. 9:19 a.m. They noticed how often the priest's name appeared. Not as a suspect. As a helper. As a constant presence at the edges of the story. Always there. Never questioned. 10:02 a.m. The decision was made to speak with him again. By then, he was already old. Fragile looking. Harmless. Which made the conversation uncomfortable from the start. 10:48 a.m. The interview room was small. Neutral. Designed to unsettle most people. He was not unsettled. He answered calmly. Carefully. He had practiced these answers for years. Not consciously, but through repetition. Truth and omission had blurred into something seamless. 11:33 a.m. The investigators left the room with more questions than answers. But something had shifted. Doubt had entered the frame. And doubt, once introduced, spreads. 12:15 p.m. Back in the present, the inmate sat on his bunk, hands folded. Lunch count passed. Another mark. Another confirmation of existence. 1:52 p.m. He reflected not on the crime, but on the mistake. Not the act itself, but the assumption. He had believed the system would never revisit the past. That belief had been logical. But logic changed with time. 3:06 p.m. In the afternoon quiet, he listened to the sounds of the unit. Coughs. Footsteps. A distant argument. Life continuing around him. Unaware. 4:41 p.m. He wondered briefly how many people still defended him. How many still couldn't reconcile the image with the accusation. He knew the number was not zero. It never was. 6:09 p.m. Dinner passed. Evening settled. The inmate returned to his cell once more. 8:58 p.m. Lights dimmed. The unit quieted. The day ended as it had begun. Predictably. 11:17 p.m. As he lay back, eyes open in the dark, a single thought returned again and again. Not fear. Not remorse. But calculation. If the crime had not been perfect, it had been close. When control began to slip at 12:04 a.m., the inmate woke suddenly. Not from a sound. Not from a dream. From the sensation that something had shifted. He remained still, eyes open, staring into the dark ceiling above him. His breathing stayed steady, but his awareness sharpened. For decades, he had trusted routine. Routine had always protected him. But tonight, routine felt thinner. 12:31 a.m. Down the tier, a guard's radio crackled briefly, then fell silent. The inmate tracked the sound in his mind, mapping distance and direction without moving his head. He had done this his entire life, not with radios, but with people. Who spoke when? Who hesitated? Who avoided certain topics? Patterns were comforting because they were predictable, and predictability meant safety. 1:18 a.m. He shifted slightly on the bunk, adjusting his position to ease the ache in his back. Age had introduced a variable he could no longer fully control. Time inside prison moved slowly, but time inside his body did not. That bothered him more than the walls. 29 years earlier, 6:43 p.m. He sat alone at a small table, pen in hand, writing carefully. The room was quiet. The window was open just enough to let in evening air. He reviewed the day in his mind, not emotionally, but structurally. What had gone according to plan? What had deviated? What could still pose risk? There was satisfaction, but it was muted. Completion did not bring relief. Only confirmation. 7:12 p.m. He folded the paper and placed it in a drawer beneath other documents that meant nothing to anyone else. Paper was dangerous, but only if people knew what to look for. And no one ever had. 8:40 p.m. A phone call came. A routine check-in. A voice asking a question that sounded casual but wasn't. Did you see him today? Yes, he replied calmly. Everything okay? Yes. The truth, delivered efficiently. Back to the present. 2:02 a.m. The inmate closed his eyes again. Not to sleep. To reconstruct. Memory had become sharper here, not softer. With nothing else to occupy his mind, details resurfaced with uncomfortable clarity. The times. The pauses. The moments where choice still existed. He had chosen correctly then, but choice was finite. 3:11 a.m. Another inmate coughed repeatedly, struggling to breathe through congestion. The old man listened, not out of concern, but habit. Listening had always given him advantage. 4:26 a.m. He thought about the investigators, not as adversaries, as systems. Systems could be predicted, up to a point. The problem was that systems evolved. And evolution introduced uncertainty. 5:08 a.m. Morning count. The door slid open. The guard glanced inside, hesitated for a fraction of a second, the same hesitation as the day before. The inmate noticed. He always noticed. That hesitation was new. 5:10 a.m. Count's good, the guard said, though his tone lacked the usual disinterest. The door closed. The inmate remained seated. Hesitation was not accusation, but it was movement. 5:47 a.m. At breakfast, the inmate took his usual seat. The tray rattled slightly as it was placed in front of him. Across the room, a guard spoke quietly with another officer, eyes drifting toward the old man more than once. He did not react. Reaction would confirm relevance. Relevance invited scrutiny. 6:33 a.m. He ate slowly, deliberately. Around him, conversations rose and fell. Speculation moved quickly in prison, faster than outside. He could feel it beginning. 7:19 a.m. Back in his cell, he sat with his hands folded, posture upright. This was not prayer. It was calculation. He replayed the interviews. The reopened file. The tone of the questions. Investigators had not accused him, but they had positioned him closer to the center. That was dangerous. 8:04 a.m. The memory returned uninvited. The first time someone had looked at him differently. Not with trust, with curiosity. That look had unsettled him more than fear ever could. Fear was expected. Curiosity was unpredictable. 35 years earlier. 11:56 a.m. He checked his watch. Everything remained aligned. The building was quiet. The inmate, then just a man, sat waiting, unaware of how fully the situation had already been shaped around him. The priest felt no urgency. Urgency led to mistakes. 12:09 p.m. The door closed softly. The sound had been insignificant then. It echoed now. Back to the present. 9:22 a.m. The inmate was called out of his cell. Not abruptly. Not forcefully. His name spoken calmly. That calmness unsettled him. 9:29 a.m. The walk down the corridor felt longer than usual. Other inmates watched. Curiosity again. He kept his gaze forward. 9:36 a.m. The interview room was unchanged. Same table. Same chairs. Same neutral walls. But the people were different. New faces. Younger. Less deferential. 9:41 a.m. They asked him to sit. He did. They asked him about timelines. He answered. They asked him to repeat details he had repeated dozens of times before. He did. But something had changed. They interrupted him. Corrected him. Tested him. 10:08 a.m. One investigator slid a document across the table. A transcript. His words. From years earlier. Does this look accurate to you? He read it carefully. Too carefully. And that was the mistake. 10:21 a.m. Memory is imperfect, especially after decades. Perfect recall is suspicious. The investigators noticed. 10:37 a.m. They did not accuse him. They didn't need to. They allowed silence to stretch. He filled it. He always had. 10:59 a.m. When the interview ended, they thanked him politely. Politeness did not mean reassurance. It meant distance. 11:14 a.m. Back in his cell, the inmate sat down heavily. For the first time since arriving, he felt fatigue that was not physical, the kind that came from sustained vigilance. Bell CTR number 2, Strategic Midpoint CTA. Stories like this don't happen in isolation. Subscribe to understand how systems protect people and how they eventually fail them. 11:32 a.m. Lunch arrived. He barely touched it. Appetite had never mattered much to him. But today, even routine nourishment felt unnecessary. 12:46 p.m. He lay back on the bunk, staring upward. The ceiling no longer felt neutral. It felt observant, as though the structure itself were aware of him. 1:58 p.m. He thought about legacy, not redemption. Legacy, how he would be remembered, what people would choose to believe. Because belief, he knew, mattered more than truth. 3:17 p.m. In the afternoon lull, a younger inmate approached his cell. "You really did that?" the man asked quietly. The old man looked at him, said nothing. Silence had always been his strongest response. 4:44 p.m. The guard moved the younger inmate along. The moment passed, but the question lingered. 6:02 p.m. Dinner passed uneventfully, but uneventful no longer meant safe. 7:29 p.m. As night settled, the inmate returned to his bunk. He folded his hands again, not in prayer, in readiness. 9:51 p.m. Lights dimmed. The unit quieted, but sleep did not come. 11:58 p.m. As the day ended, a realization settled in. He was no longer ahead of the system. He was inside it. And systems do not forgive. They process. The unit was quiet in the way only institutions become quiet. Not peaceful. Contained. The inmate lay on his side, facing the wall. His hands were tucked beneath the thin blanket. Fingers curled slightly, as if holding onto something invisible. He wasn't asleep. Sleep had become optional since the interviews resumed. Night was when records spoke loudest. 12:44 a.m. He replayed the words he had heard earlier that day. Not accusations. Not threats. Questions. Questions framed carefully enough to sound neutral, but sharp enough to cut. Questions meant to test memory against paper. And paper, he knew, was unforgiving. 35 years earlier. 2:18 p.m. A filing cabinet drawer slid shut. The sound had been brief, almost forgettable. Inside were reports written by people who believed they were recording facts. Dates. Times. Observations. None of them realized how much they had missed. Not because they were careless, but because they trusted the wrong things. 2:41 p.m. He had sat at his desk, reading through copies of those early notes. They were incomplete, which meant they were safe. Incomplete records created space, and space could be filled with interpretation. Back to the present. 1:23 a.m. The inmate shifted, easing pressure from his hip. Age demanded adjustments he could no longer ignore. He stared at the faint outline of the cell door, knowing that behind it existed layers of documentation that now spoke more clearly than people ever had. 2:06 a.m. He remembered the first time someone mentioned the file. The phrase had sounded casual, almost dismissive. Old file, the investigator had said. Thin file. Thin files were dangerous. They invited revisiting. 3:12 a.m. A guard's footsteps slowed outside his cell. Paused. Then continued. That pause was new. He counted the seconds automatically. 1, 2, 3. Enough time to look. 4:03 a.m. He wondered which document had done it. Which line? Which small inconsistency had prompted the second look? It was never the big things. Never the obvious. It was always the detail no one had cared about at the time. 34 years earlier. 10:51 a.m. An officer had written. Subject reports last seeing individual shortly before noon. Accurate, but vague. Vagueness protected him. 11:07 a.m. Another report noted. No unusual behavior observed. Also accurate, but incomplete, because unusual depended on expectation, and expectations had been shaped by trust. Back to the present. 5:17 a.m. Morning count. The door opened. The guard looked directly at him this time. Not lingering. but intentional. The inmate met his gaze calmly, then looked away first. Deference was useful. 5:46 a.m. At breakfast, he sat at a different table. Not by choice. By instruction. Small changes mattered. Small changes meant attention. 6:29 a.m. He watched a younger inmate struggle to open a milk carton, hands shaking with frustration. The old man recognized the feeling. Loss of control rarely arrived dramatically. It arrived through inconvenience. 7:12 a.m. Back in his cell, he was handed paperwork. Copies. Printouts. Words frozen in ink. He read them slowly. They were not accusations. They were comparisons. Statements aligned side by side. Dates matched against dates. Times against times. 7:48 a.m. He noticed it then. A discrepancy. Not large, but undeniable. A 15-minute window that had once seemed irrelevant now stood out. 15 minutes unaccounted for. 15 minutes that paper could not explain. 8:31 a.m. Memory filled the gap easily. Too easily. That was the danger. Memory adapted. Paper did not. 9:06 a.m. He was escorted again. Same hallway. Different destination. The movement itself sent a message. You are no longer peripheral. 9:19 a.m. The room this time had no table. Only chairs. Opposite each other. The setup was intentional. Less formality. More pressure. 9:24 a.m. They spoke about records. About process. About how cases used to be handled. He listened. Carefully. Every word revealed how much they already knew. 9:51 a.m. One investigator said something simple. We're not looking at what happened. We're looking at why it was never questioned. The inmate understood immediately. That was the real danger. 10:28 a.m. They asked about his role in the community. His routines. His responsibilities. He described them plainly. He had rehearsed this narrative his entire life. But now, the same story felt exposed. Because they were no longer listening for truth. They were listening for position. 11:13 a.m. When he returned to his cell, his legs felt weak. Not from fear. From recognition. They had shifted focus from the act to the access. And access had always been his advantage. 12:02 p.m. Lunch passed untouched again. Food had lost relevance. Sustenance now came from calculation. 1:14 p.m. He sat on his bunk and examined his hands. Not sentimentally. Analytically. Hands that had signed forms. Unlocked doors. Moved people through spaces without resistance. Hands that records never described. 2:37 p.m. He thought about how institutions write history. Not as narrative. As process. And process erased nuance. Nuance had protected him. 3:58 p.m. A guard stopped outside his cell. You got visitors tomorrow, he said. Tomorrow. A word that now carried weight. 4:41 p.m. The inmate nodded. Said nothing. Silence remained his safest response. 6:06 p.m. Dinner. The same tray. The same motions. But the air felt different. Charged. As if everyone sensed something approaching. 7:22 p.m. As evening settled, he lay back and closed his eyes. Not to rest. To prepare. Tomorrow would not be about memory. It would be about confrontation. 9:08 p.m. Lights dimmed. The unit quieted. But his mind remained alert. 11:36 p.m. One final thought surfaced before midnight. He had always believed that if the truth emerged, it would do so through confession. He had never considered records might speak first. When time stopped protecting him. At 12:01 a.m. The inmate did not sleep. Not because of fear, but because sleep would mean surrendering control, even briefly. He lay on his back, eyes open, listening to the slow rhythm of the unit breathing around him. Distant ventilation. A cough 2 cells down. The muted scrape of shoes during late-night rounds. Tomorrow had already begun forming in his mind. 1:17 a.m. He replayed the word the guard had used earlier. Visitors. Not investigators. Not clergy. Visitors. That distinction mattered. Visitors meant exposure. Exposure meant narrative. And narrative had always been the one thing he shaped better than anyone else. Until now. 2:43 a.m. He shifted carefully, easing stiffness from his legs. Age had turned even small movements into negotiations. In another life, he had helped others reconcile with inevitability. Now, inevitability had arrived without asking for guidance. 35 years earlier. 6:04 p.m. He had stood alone in the same room, closing the door gently behind him. The space had looked unchanged. That illusion had been comforting. He had believed that if environments remained stable, outcomes would too. That belief had carried him for decades. Back to the present. 4:58 a.m. Morning count. The door slid open. This time, the guard didn't hesitate. He looked directly at the inmate and nodded once. Not in respect, but acknowledgement. A silent signal. Today is different. 5:31 a.m. Breakfast arrived. The inmate ate more than he had in days. Not from hunger, from preparation. He understood what today required. Clarity. 6:22 a.m. He washed his hands carefully at the sink, watching the water run over skin that had grown thin and translucent with age. These hands had guided people through their worst moments. These hands had never trembled when it mattered. They trembled now. 7:09 a.m. The guard returned. You're up. No explanation. No ceremony. The inmate rose slowly and followed. 7:17 a.m. The walk through the corridor felt exposed. Other inmates watched openly now. No whispers. No speculation. Just observation. Observation was worse. 7:25 a.m. The room was brighter than the interview rooms had been. Natural light from a narrow window. 3 chairs. 2 occupied. 1 empty. Waiting. 7:29 a.m. He sat. Across from him were people who had once trusted him without hesitation. Their expressions were restrained. Professional, but strained. 7:41 a.m. They spoke first. Not about guilt. About time. About what it meant for truth to arrive late. They explained the evidence. Not dramatically, not emotionally. Just enough. 8:06 a.m. He listened without interruption. Listening had always been his advantage. But now, it offered no leverage. 8:22 a.m. When they asked him if he wanted to speak, the room fell silent. This was the moment he had imagined countless times. The moment where he would choose which version of himself survived. 8:24 a.m. He spoke, not to confess, not to deny, but to contextualize. He framed actions as misunderstandings, absence as coincidence, trust as inevitability. It was a practiced approach, one that had worked before. 8:51 a.m. They did not argue. They did not interrupt. They allowed him to finish. That was when he understood. They were no longer listening to be convinced. They were listening to confirm. 9:07 a.m. One of them slid a final document across the table. A timeline. Reconstructed. Precise. Unforgiving. It didn't accuse. It didn't explain. It simply existed. 9:18 a.m. The inmate stared at it longer than necessary. Paper had finally done what people never could. It had removed ambiguity. 9:32 a.m. They stood. The meeting was over. There was no dramatic conclusion. No raised voices. No declaration. Just finality. 9:47 a.m. Back in his cell, the inmate sat down slowly. The door closed. The sound was definitive. 10:14 a.m. For the first time since his incarceration, he felt something unfamiliar. Not fear. Not guilt. Irrelevance. The story no longer belonged to him. 11:26 a.m. News traveled fast. Guards were quieter. Inmates watched differently. Some with curiosity. Some with satisfaction. Some with disbelief. 12:03 p.m. Lunch came. He ate in silence. Time moved forward regardless of meaning. 1:41 p.m. He thought about how he would be remembered, not by those who had trusted him, but by those who would never reconcile the two versions of him. The guide. The inmate. 3:09 p.m. The afternoon light shifted. He lay back and closed his eyes. Not to escape, but to accept. 4:58 p.m. The realization settled fully. The crime had never been perfect. It had simply outlasted attention. 6:12 p.m. Dinner passed. Evening came. Routine returned. But routine no longer protected him. 8:37 p.m. As lights dimmed, the inmate stared at the ceiling one last time. He had spent a lifetime controlling silence. Now, silence controlled him. 11:59 p.m. The day ended. And with it, the final illusion that time alone could absolve anything. This was one story, but it's not the only one. Subscribe to understand how crimes disappear, how systems fail, and what happens when truth arrives too late. When the story ends, but the question doesn't. At the end of every investigation, there is a moment when the facts stop changing. The files are closed. The timeline is complete. The system decides it has done enough. But for the people involved, that moment rarely feels like justice. In this case, the truth did not arrive with urgency. It arrived quietly, late, after reputations were cemented and trust had already done its damage. The man at the center of this story was not exposed because he confessed. He was not caught because someone saw everything clearly in the moment. He was uncovered because time ran out on silence. And that raises a question far more uncomfortable than guilt or innocence. How many crimes don't survive because they are imperfect, but because no one thinks to look again? How many people are protected not by innocence, but by familiarity, authority, and time? This story is unsettling not because of what one man did, but because of how easily it was allowed to disappear. Because systems don't fail loudly. They fail slowly, quietly, one assumption at a time. And by the time the truth finally surfaces, the damage has already settled into history. The case may be closed, but the lesson is not. Thanks for watching. Like, share, and subscribe.